Close your eyes for just a second, and picture this. There's a mountain. It sits high up in the dusty hill country of ancient Judea, a desolate, rocky summit just baking under the Near Eastern sun. Now, if you were a historical observer standing there millennia ago, you'd be looking at a landscape that was about to bear the most staggering weight of human history imaginable. Long before the great temples were ever built, way before the priesthood was established, and honestly, before the law itself was even written down, a father climbed this mountain with his son. And what happened on that dusty peak of Mount Moriah? Well, it wasn't just a dramatic historical event. It was a perfectly enacted living prophecy.
For 3,000 years, Jewish scholars, Christian theologians, philosophers, they've all wrestled with the narrative of Genesis 22. But to truly understand this ancient text, we really have to look past the surface level. We have to adopt the lens of an ancient scholar and carefully unearth the deep linguistic roots, the geography, and the deliberate typological links hiding right there in the Hebrew text. Because when we do, we see that the story of the Father, the Son, and the mountain was pointing to something much, much larger. You see, geography in the biblical text is never just an accident. It is deeply, deeply theological. Let's trace the staggering historical weight of this specific location, Mount Moriah. As 2 Chronicles documents, the very place where God directed Abram to offer his son eventually became the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, which was purchased by King David. And it was upon that exact rocky summit that Solomon built the first temple. Think about the gravity of that. The site of Abram's terrifying ordeal became the absolute epicenter of substitutionary sacrifice for the entire nation of Israel for 1,000 years. The ram caught in the thicket at Moriah was simply the very first sacrifice on the mountain of the Lord. The Hebrew name for this agonizing narrative is the Akedah, which translates directly to the binding. It comes from a Hebrew root meaning to tie up or to bind. What's absolutely fascinating here is that this specific Hebrew word is used exactly one time in the entire Hebrew Bible, just once, right here in Genesis 22, describing the horrific physical action of Abraham binding his son before placing him on the wood. That single terrifying physical action on the altar gave the word its entire unrepeatable theological weight in Jewish tradition. It became the definitive title for this unparalleled moment in history.
Now, what's really interesting here is that the text confronts us immediately with a fascinating Hebrew word in the very first verse, Nisa. The text explicitly tells us God tested Abraham. Nisa means to prove, to refine, or to examine for purity. It is absolutely crucial to understand that this was not a temptation toward evil, but a test of character. It was this extreme ordeal designed to reveal and refine what was actually already true in Abraham's heart. We, as the readers, know right from the start that it's a test. Abraham, however, he begins this agonizing ascent entirely in the dark.
The text describes Abraham's obedience as devastatingly methodical. God demands his son, his only son, the one whom he loves, 4 intense layers of identification. And in response, Abraham rises early. He saddles his donkey, and if you know anything about ancient travel, you know that alone requires an immense amount of patience. He takes 2 young men with him, and notice the heavy sensory reality of the text here. He cuts the wood for the burnt offering himself. Can you even imagine the sound of the axe splitting that wood, knowing exactly what it was intended for? And then they walk. For 3 long, agonizing days, Abraham travels with his son, carrying the massive weight of this command with every single step toward the mountain. On the way up, we reach arguably the most heartbreaking dialogue in the entire patriarchal narrative. Isaac turns to his father, points out the fire in the wood, and asks, "Where is the lamb?" Abraham replies, "God will provide for himself the lamb." On the surface, it sounds like a desperate father just stalling for time. But the Hebrew root used here is ra'ah, which means to see or to perceive. In this specific form, it carries the profound weight of divine foresight. When God sees, provision inevitably follows. Under crushing pressure, Abraham was actually speaking a profound divine prophecy.
Finally, they reach the summit. The tension in the narrative builds to an almost unbearable peak. Abraham meticulously builds the stone altar. He carefully arranges the heavy wood. He binds his son Isaac, laying him right on top of the altar. And then he reaches out his hand and takes the knife. Time literally seems to stand still on the mountain. He raises the blade, but right before it can fall, the angel of the Lord calls out to him from heaven, completely halting the sacrifice with this sudden merciful command, "Do not lay your hand on the boy."
Abraham lifts his eyes, and there, caught in a thicket by its horns, is a ram, a substitute. Abraham takes the ram and offers it up in place of his son. Because of this, Abraham permanently names that specific geographic location YHWH Yireh, the Lord will see, or the Lord will provide. As the text says, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. He forever anchors God's divine provision to that exact mountain summit. But as early Christian readers would later argue, the provision of that ram was really only the shadow of something much, much greater.
And that brings us right into the New Testament parallels. The ancient scholars of the early church saw these connections vividly. Tertullian, writing way back in the 2nd century, documented this historical parallel perfectly. He wrote, Isaac, being led by his father to be a victim and carrying himself the firewood, at that moment was a figure of Christ's death. The earliest readers of these texts recognized almost immediately that the events on Moriah were not just Jewish history, they were a blueprint.
Origen, who was a towering scholar from the 3rd century, took this blueprint even further. He noted that because Isaac carried the wood for his own sacrifice, which was a duty typically reserved for the priest, he became a figure of Christ. And this brilliantly illustrates his point. As Origen puts it, he is then both victim and priest. These ancient readers were deliberately laying the Genesis account and the Gospel account side by side and finding this perfect, mirrored reflection.
Let's look at those reflections ourselves, starting with the language of the father's sacrifice. In Genesis 22, God tests Abraham with this incredibly precise, layered, 4-part command. Take your son, your only son, whom you love. Now look at the Gospel of John. 2,000 years later, John uses the exact same language to describe God's love for the world. He gave his only son. The linguistic echo is undeniably deliberate. For ancient theologians, the agony of the human father on Mount Moriah was read as a direct window into the heart of the divine Father.
Now I want you to visualize the physical reality of the parallel here. In Genesis, we have a beloved son bearing the heavy wooden instrument of his own death on his back, walking up a rocky summit. In the Gospel of John, chapter 19, we see Jesus going out, bearing his own wooden cross to Golgotha. And here is the devastating historical reality. Golgotha, the place of the skull, is part of that exact same mountain range of Moriah. The Gospel writers are deliberately framing Jesus as the ultimate son, carrying his wood up that exact same mountain.
And what about those 3 agonizing days of travel? The author of Hebrews in the New Testament actually examines this, using a highly critical Greek term, en parabole, which means in a parable or figuratively. Hebrews explains that Abraham considered God able to raise the dead, and, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. For 3 days, Abraham counted Isaac as dead, only to receive him back alive. To the author of Hebrews, God intentionally designed this ancient event to be a living, breathing parable of the 3 days in the tomb and the resurrection.
Remember Abraham's prophetic promise to Isaac? God will provide for himself the lamb. Notice he didn't say a ram, which is what was ultimately caught in the thicket. He explicitly said the lamb. Fast forward 2 millennia to the Jordan River. John the Baptist sees Jesus approaching and declares with thunderous realization, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." To the early church, the ram was just a temporary substitute. They saw Abraham's promise echoing across the centuries until John identified the true lamb.
And then there is this staggering physical detail. The substitute in Genesis wasn't just wandering by, it was caught in a thicket by its horns, completely entangled in the sharp briars and thorns of the mountain. Now look at John 19. The Roman soldiers twist together a crown of thorns and press it onto Jesus' head. The Gospel of John presents the true Lamb of God, ultimately wearing the very thorns that the ancient substitute was caught in. I mean, the perfection of that textual imagery is simply breathtaking.
So the crucial point is, did Abraham actually know what he was prophesying? Well, the Gospel of John claims he did. Speaking to the religious leaders, Jesus makes this astonishing claim. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. Jesus is telling us that Abraham peered through the shadow of that ram on the altar. Standing on that dusty peak, Abraham saw past his own era and actually saw the ultimate sacrifice that was coming to that very mountain.
Which brings us to the resounding emotional resolution of this entire narrative. In Genesis, the angel stops the knife. God spares Abraham's son. But the Apostle Paul, writing in Romans 8:32, reveals the ultimate completion of the promise of YHW Yireh. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. 2,000 years after Abraham, on that exact same mountain, God the Father did not stay his hand. For the Apostle Paul, there was no substitute ram in the thicket because Jesus himself had become the substitute.
The Akedah is not just a story about a man's faith under pressure. It is a masterpiece of historical and textual orchestration, a literally flawless shadow cast backward through time by the cross of Christ. It forces us to step back and just look at the majesty of the text, and it leaves us with this final thought. If the textual shadow cast on Mount Moriah was this intricate and this profound, how much more glorious did these ancient writers view the light it was pointing toward?
If this video blessed you, subscribe, like, and share. God bless you.